Welcome to the National Iron and Steel Heritage Museum. Tonight we will learn about World War II Liberty ships named for African Americans, as presented by Tyree Warner, a former Coatesville Youth Initiative intern here at the museum. Tyree is now a contractor in the Coatesville area. The Coatesville mill has a long history of supplying the shipbuilding industry. In 1825, the original mill, known as the Brandywine Iron Works and Nail Factory, supplied iron for the Cadorus, the first iron-hulled vessel built in America. Luke & Steel made steel for the Liberty ships, a class of cargo ship built in the United States during World War II. One of the Liberty ships was named for Rebecca Lukens, an ironmaster who took over the Brandywine Iron Works and Nail Factory in 1825 and operated the business successfully for 25 years. Even today, the Coatesville plant, now owned by Cleveland Cliffs, is a major supplier for the United States Navy. We would like to thank our sponsors, the Stuart Houston Charitable Trust, PICO, the Houston Foundation, HERS, Prosper Bank, Jacobs Wiper Architects, Citadel Federal Credit Union, the Brandywine Health Foundation, and Peter and Ruth Nunn. It's my pleasure to welcome Tyree Warner.
Good evening. Today we will be looking into the history behind the line of ships known as the Liberty ships. In honor of Black History Month, we will primarily be focusing on the history surrounding the construction of the Liberty line and the Black history involved. There were a total of 2,710 Liberty ships constructed between 1941 and 1945. At the height of mass production, the process was so efficient that they were able to construct, on average, 2 to 3 ships a day. These ships were not known for their renowned quality nor technology. The more impressive feat was the sheer production line. In the beginning stages, the ships were purposed to send cargo and aid the war efforts. But later down the line, some ships were fitted with defense systems and other accommodations, which is amazing considering the original intention was just to transmit military equipment and munitions. But there's a deeper story to understand the events leading up to the construction of these ships. The racial tensions in the 1940s were in the infant stages of growth. The Jim Crow laws were still prevalent in the South, and in the North, the process of integration was still a foreign idea to many. In the wake of the Second World War, tensions started to make some headway, but still had a long way to go. The Allied forces were constantly bombarded with attacks. They were losing ships faster than they could be built. The United States decided to step to the plate with the construction of the Liberty ships. The dire situation opened up a door for growth and new ideas. The U.S. needed troops to aid the war effort, and they also needed hands to help build the pre-planned 2,751 ships. In the early 1940s, segregation was still a common thing to see all over the country. There were still black and white only schools, businesses, and even public events. The disparity in living conditions between ethnic groups was still a wide gap. Many people of color were adjusting to the grim reality of discrimination. Some accepted the circumstances and strived to be successful despite the hardships, while others were uniting to overcome inequality. The Second World War was starting to be a conversation point for many, and seen as a priority to those in authority. The British forces were fighting a hard battle, losing many soldiers, military equipment, and most prominently, naval ships. Allies were in dire need for an upper hand, and under the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, the U.S. took their stand on the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler. The setbacks the Allies endured saw the British calling to the U.S. help replace the lost vessels, and this is what sparked what is known as the Liberty Line. The plan was to build the ships faster than they can be sunk. The German forces had the well-known and well-feared German U-boat. This submersible vessel was responsible for many Allied losses on the water. The technology to overcome this would have taken time that the U.S. and the Allies didn't have. In early 1940, the U.S. filled an order issued by the British government that saw 60 ocean-class freighters be built to replace lost vessels. As the war continued that year, the number of ships requested rose to the 300s by April of that year. Evident that the situation was getting bloodier by the day, the U.S. made revisions to the construction process to speed production and increase volume. A total of 18 shipyards were tasked with assembling the pre-constructed sections. Some notable shipyards include the Bethlehem Fairfield Shipyard in Baltimore, Maryland, the Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation's yard in Portland, Oregon, and the California Shipbuilding Corporation's yard in Terminal Island, California. The Bethlehem Fairfield yard saw the most Liberties constructed, with a total of 385 Liberties constructed and launched. A high demand for industrial production opened up a door for many opportunities for employment. It also saw a demand for more men to enlist in the military branches and to aid the war efforts. Before the Second World War, the military branches were still segregated, but with the magnitude of the war, it paved way to some of the first integrated forces. In the African American communities, the opportunities didn't go unnoticed. A single Liberty took over 40 skilled trades to be completed. In 1943 proved to be one of the most productive years of the decade. An astonishing 1,900 ships were built in this year alone, and many of those being Liberties that were assembled. Men of color who seek to travel the world, gain a new perspective, and devote themselves to a greater cause now had a chance to enlist in the Army. Many men of color who seeked employment got a chance to join labor forces, primarily in shipyards. Many individuals came from the South to the North. It was a great opportunity given that they left behind an annual income of around $500 a year to pursue prospects of around $3,000 annually. To better understand this, in today's currency, men of the South were leaving behind an annual income of around $9,000 to pursue an annual income of $54,000. The shipyards also saw women of color enter the labor force. Many were tasked with the trade of welding. Ocean freighters typically had their sections riveted together, but the revisions made saw the U.S. changing tactics to save time. With the duration that the war lasted, some ships were later repurposed, and with the lesser quality shipbuilding methods, it opened up even more doors for the labor force. There was also a big demand for machining. Thousands of munitions were assembled by the hands of people of color. The opportunity to work on aircraft and other meticulous tasks were often closed off to the people of color. At the time, Roosevelt was more focused on the war efforts rather than the progression of the civil rights movement. This resulted in not all of the shipyards offering the same amount of opportunity. The Portland, Oregon shipyard had only called for people of color to contribute when things were running behind schedule. There were multiple occasions where the gates of the yard had signs posted that stated, "Help wanted, whites only." And the story was very similar to the two shipyards in Georgia as well as the single shipyard in Alabama. Those not engaged in the war efforts were fighting for equal rights. In many cases, the African American labor community voiced their concerns to the civil rights leaders and African American activists. Some shipyards refused to give people of color employment under the pretense that they did not have union cards. And on the other hand, most unions didn't give people of color union cards without employment. The president of the largest black union in the country saw a call for action. A. Philip Randolph, president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, organized a march on Washington, D.C. due to the unjust treatment from employers. Randolph attempted to speak with government officials and even the president himself, but his efforts were met to no avail. When word reached that the March on Washington was expected to reach 100,000, President Roosevelt and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt sat with Randolph and other prominent figures promptly. This conversation led to the Executive Order 8802. It saw the banishment of discrimination by war contractors to the individuals they employed. This order was followed up by the Fair Employment Practice Committee. Randolph then canceled the march once this order was in place. He later would hold rallies amongst the community to ensure that the committee upheld their order righteously. One of the most notable rallies was held in New York City in the summer of 1942. The rally had over 10,000 members from the community. They joined together to speak their voice, and they wanted inclusion into the labor force. Executive Order 8802 was a major accomplishment for the black community, and this was a key step into the events following its establishment. While all these events were taking place behind the scenes, there was still a battle being fought, and so the Liberty Line continued to be approved, pre-assembled, and constructed. Before I start detailing the black history involved, we will show a brief clip of NISHM member Larry Freeman, a volunteer docent at the Liberty ship SS John Brown.
There's a Liberty ship. Now, they didn't really have the term Liberty ship right away, because what was happening at that time, the German U-boats were really playing havoc on the ships that were supplying England. I mean, England had shipyards, but now they can't build ships at night. If they left the lights on, there's your target there. So they were hurting, and the Germans were sinking these ships faster than anybody could build them. So they approached our country, and they said, can you build us some ships? So we said, sure. What do you got in mind? Well, what they had in mind was this ocean class of ship. It's a little bit different than what became the Liberty. The sizes were different. You notice the stack is just a straight stack. Now ours is a little bit different. But we built them. Now, we did not follow their blueprints exactly. If we're building them here, we got to know several things. First of all, what can our steel companies supply us with? In other words, how big a plate? Raw materials, what are we dealing with? It might be different in England. Now, the question came up, well, what are you going to power this thing with? Well, the good choice at that time would have been steam turbines. They were much faster and all that stuff. And I'm sure they probably asked us about it, and we said, no, we can't get turbines because all the companies building steam turbines are contracted for Navy ships and stuff like that. We can't get them. So the Brits said, well, all right, triple expansion steam. Now, how big is it? Well, this thing's 3 stories tall. It's a monster. Weighs 144 tons, 2,500 horsepower. You're on the engine forward, you're going forward. Reverse it, you're going reverse. Pretty good system. So there's your introduction to a triple expansion steam engine. Now the nice thing about it, I forgot to say this, 12 companies are building them. You could take a part out of the O'Brien's engine or ours, were built by 2 different companies, totally interchangeable. Great concept. This is unloading cargo somewhere in the Pacific. The reason I say that, I'm looking at the palm trees over there. It took time to load, time to unload. People ask, well, how much cargo could they hold? Now, I can razzle-dazzle you with long tons, short tons, all that stuff. I'm going to simplify it and say that the average Liberty ship could carry about 300 boxcars full of stuff. That's a lot of stuff. Now, some of the ships were altered later on. They changed the cargo hold dimension a little bit where they could haul airplanes. After the war was over, we hauled steam locomotives over there to rebuild the economies of the people that we beat. I swear we're the only country that does that, you know, but it's the right thing to do. So anyway, how do they get stuff in there? First of all, there's a tarp over this. They take the tarp off. And then there's hatch boards that will fit in there, and then there's I-beams that would drop into that slot. There's the I-beams. Lift all that out, and then you got a straight shot to the sky. And when you get all that out, then you get down below, you do the same thing to get to the bottom of the cargo hold. It took time. These are the living conditions. Now, see, you got to look at detail here. Look at that. They had the air conditioner running. Wow, that was it. The power system on a Liberty was 115 volt direct current. That was it. It had 3 generators. The biggest motor was 7.5 horsepower for the refrigeration unit. Everything else was just, you know, lighting pretty much. The guys that ran it were Merchant Marine. They were civilians. They did have Navy people on there called the Navy Armed Guard. Those are the guys that man the guns. They work pretty good together. The crew size, you might have, let's say, maybe 50, 60 Merchant Marine. You might have 40 or so Armed Guard. It depends on the ship. Now, in our ship was modified. We put a lot of bunks in there because we hauled troops, up to 500 troops. Well, they gave us some extra guns on there. They probably had more Navy Armed Guard as a little protection. But things are tight. You know, not a lot of room. Rosie the Riveter. It's like a Norman Rockwell painting. You can look at the subject matter, but many times it's the background that's the most important. What she's working on, she's doing some welding there. I mean, Rosie the Riveter did welding, did riveting, did you name it, she did it. And if it wasn't for the Rosie the Riveters, we might be speaking a different language today. They made one heck of a contribution to the war effort. Anyway, those are what they call the double bottoms. Now, she's been working on them. Just to give you an idea what I'm talking about. All right, the hull plate, that's the bottom of the ship. That's against the water. The bottom of the cargo hold is this plate here. And in between, they got the ribs. Okay, this is curved, so that would go against the hull. They would actually take the deck plate, flip it upside down, weld the ribs on. In other words, upside down, easier to weld. And then when you're done, ready to put it in, then you flip it over. You put it against the hull plates and weld it or rivet it. Now, our ship had a riveted hull. That created some problems for us later on. We got 5 cargo holds. Number 1, 2, 3, and 4 and 5 behind there. Now, this is what they call the tween deck. In other words, when you come on our ship, you come up the main deck. When you go down to get your breakfast or lunch or whatever, you're on what they call tween deck. It's not the bottom of the cargo hold, it's in between. But again, they would take the hatch covers off, all the beams and everything, and then they would come down here, take the same thing out here, now you got a direct shot. But the point is, when you're loading cargo, you can only swing the cargo over as wide or as forward or toward the stern as that opening. So you had to manhandle this stuff. It took time. Number 2 is the biggest cargo hold. This is the Patrick Henry, first Liberty ship launched in 1941 out of Baltimore. If you got enough room behind you, wide place of water there, you can just launch these things backwards. Let it slide right into the river. They didn't really have what I'd call a name for Liberty ship, but you remember Patrick Henry, what did he say? What was that famous speech? Give me liberty or give me death. Wow, you guys paid attention in school. That's pretty good. Well, anyway, they thought, well, that's pretty good. I remember Roosevelt making a speech. He was talking about the Liberty ships, and he said, well, these ships will spread liberty throughout the world. And you know what? They really did. Without them, I don't know where we'd be today. So anyway, if you got a nice wide body of water, you can launch them that way, or you can go this way. Now, I guarantee you, that would be better than any ride at Hershey Park today. Probably be shorter, but what a ride. And no, they didn't tip over. But there was a yard, I saw a picture, skinny body of water. They had ways on both sides. So they could launch ships this side sideways, on the other side sideways. Now, I don't think I'd want to launch 2 at the same time, but, you know, that's what they did. This is taken out in California. Now, the ship is launched, it's in the water, but it's not done yet. They put it in these outfitting piers, and now they got to finish it. In other words, they got to finish some plumbing work. They have no fuel on board. They got to get that on there. They have no anchor chain or anchors. Notice there's no guns in the gun tubs. They got to get them on there yet. It took about 3 days. Can you imagine? We're talking 24 hours a day to get these things done. Now, this ship, Robert Peary, is that the name? Yep. This one was launched in California. They welded their ships out there. It was quicker. Well, quicker, but it presented problems later on. 4 days, 15 and a half hours. I'll say that again. 4 days from when they laid that first plate down, 4 days plus 15 and a half hours later, that was sliding in the water. And then another 3 days to, hook everything up. They did it as a stunt, just to see what they could do. I guarantee you they probably never wanted to do that again, because people would be on top of people, a lot of upset people, push, push, push. But they proved that. They made sure at that point Adolf Hitler knew we could build these things faster than he can sink them. That was the goal. Okay, this is our website. And we come into tween deck number 1. Normally on a blue line tour, they come through the chapel, which is right there. There's a display there that they never see. It's called the Checkerboard Crew. And it's all about the ships that were named after black people. Most of them were sailed by black sailors. They have a whole list of names of the ships named after black people. Now, the heavyweights people know, the Harriet Tubman, the George Washington Carver, and all that. There's 5 names on that list that nobody ever heard of. And what they were seamen on Liberty ships, black seamen who were killed in the line of duty, torpedoed, air attack, I don't know. Nobody ever heard of them. But again, on the outside looking in at this picture, they must have been pretty special people, because somebody thought enough about those individuals to sponsor their name to get a ship named after them. Ultimate price.
Larry's full May 2014 lecture on the Liberty ships can be watched on the video section of our website at steelmuseum.org. The Maritime Commission Ship Naming Committee was held responsible for naming each individual ship. A total of 17 Liberty ships were named after historically prominent African American figures. The first Liberty named in honoring black history was the SS Booger T Washington, launched September 29, 1942. This vessel was commanded by Captain Hugh Mulzac, an African Caribbean merchant marine. This was his first time commanding a ship, despite earning his shipmaster rating in 1918. He set multiple records, being the first man of color to earn his master ratings, the first to command an all-integrated ship crew, and known to be the first African American captain. Initially, Mulzac was offered an all-black crew and declined to command the ship. His response was not happy, being that it would continue the stigma that the Jim Crow laws would depict it, stating, "Under no circumstance will I command a Jim Crow ship." Under his watch, his first crew was made up of 18 different ethnic groups. He also stood by his words. He made 22 round trips between 1942 and 1945. Captain Mulzac transported 18,000 integrated troops through enemy territory and endured 0 casualties through his endeavors. Although the act may have seemed small given the scale, I believe Mulzac may have inspired others who felt that their role was too small to make an impact. His solid view could have planted the seed for growth to integrate men and women alike, regardless of ethnicity. SS Booger T Washington was the first of 17 ships named after prominent African American figures. I myself question, what did these individuals contribute to society to have a ship named in their honor? I want to briefly discuss the life of some of these figures. Some of these figures are already well known to the public. People like George Washington Carver, Harriet Tubman, and Frederick Douglass are very notable on their own right. So I'd like to discuss the less spoken about individuals. Some of these people include Edward A. Savoy, John Hope, and Robert S. Abbott. There were an additional 4 individuals that were not known well to the public. In fact, they were seamen who lost their lives in battle. These 4 figures include William Cox, which was a fireman and was aboard the David Atwater when it was torpedoed and sunk. George A. Lawson, which was a messman aboard the tug Menominee, which was torpedoed and sunk. Lastly, James Kyron Walker and Robert J. Banks. They were both cooks aboard the Gulf America, and they sadly lost her life in battle when the Gulf America was torpedoed and sunk. John Hope. John Hope was known as an activist in the political setting, as well as a great educator in the South. He was born in Augusta, Atlanta, June 2nd in 1868. John was the child of biracial parents, his father being of Scottish descent. At a young age, he left his pursuit of education to lend a helping hand to his family after passing of his late father. John had a very interesting situation. His heritage went back to before the Civil War, and his ancestors being free African Americans gave his bloodline a sense of elitism. But once things were settled with his family, he was still left for a hunger for knowledge. He headed north in pursuit of progressing his education, as there was a better opportunity in the north. He graduated school at Worcester University. This was a private school in Massachusetts. After graduating, John still wanted to learn more. He then attended and graduated from Brown University, a private Ivy League school located in Rhode Island. Upon completion, he felt his calling was to teach others the things he's absorbed over the years. He returned to the South in 1906 to teach. He eventually earned himself a position as the president at the Atlanta Baptist College. In 1929, after years spent teaching passionately to young black men and women alike, the University of Atlanta selected him for their role as the first African American president. Under his guidance, he aided the development of a new graduate program that would ensure young African American men and women received an education that benefited their real-life situation. His contributions to the civil rights movement added to his legacy. Hope was a part of the Niagara movement, which saw Canadians and people of color join together to discuss social reform and political change in the United States. He was also a prominent member of the NAACP, the National Urban League, the National Association of Teachers in Colored Schools, and was also a prominent figure in the Commission of Interracial Cooperation. In the year of his death, he was awarded the Springer Award by the NAACP. Robert S. Abbott. Abbott was an African-American lawyer and most notable for his creation of the Chicago Defender, a newsletter company established in 1905. Abbott was born November 24, 1870. Born in Georgia, it is not known for certain his location of birth. Some sources indicate Abbott was born in St. Simons, Georgia, where others say his birth took place in Savannah, Georgia. Abbott was an infant when his father passed away, leaving his mother widowed. His mother, Flora Abbott, eventually married a mixed-race man from German descent. Abbott later attended Hampton Institute, now known as Hampton University, and studied the trade of printing. He was a member of the Hampton Choir that toured regularly. This traveling led Abbott to attend Kent University, where he earned a law degree under this university. After receiving his credentials, Abbott yearned for a higher calling. With his participation in the choir, he had a chance to travel all over, and he would find himself settling in the North for a short period of time. During his travels, he attempted to set up a law practice while working as a lawyer for a few years in Gary, Indiana, and Topeka, Kansas. Abbott eventually settled in Chicago in 1905. He attempted to set up a publishing company with the skills he had learned from his printing trade. In 1905, he started the Chicago Defender with an initial investment of 25 cents, and that translates to about $7 today. He printed his papers in his own house, which was encouraged by his landlord. He was eventually able to afford an 8-room apartment and use it to grow the newsletter company even further. He kept working upwards, and from there, he implored many African Americans to come to Chicago to leave the horrid conditions of the South under the Jim Crow laws. He would employ many African American men and women, as the Defender grew from circulating 50,000 papers in 1916 up to 200,000 in 1918. The newsletter company was doing so well, it was labeled the most circulated black-owned newspaper at the time. Abbott primarily employed the highly respected African American members of the railroad porters, and with this help, he formed the first black union known as the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters. This was the same union that later saw A. Philip Randolph as the president. With Abbott having control of the news stories he wanted to publish, he provided a chance to give back to his community. I believe that he inspired many people to write about their conditions in the North to their friends and their family in the South. This can be backed up by an estimated 1.5 million African Americans that migrated to the northern states from the early 1900s up until 1940. And many of the stories that he published were about people of color that migrated from the South. Abbott was also notable for becoming one of the first self-made millionaires of color. Towards the end of his career, he kept solidifying his legacy of the Chicago Defender. He had 9 goals he wanted to achieve with the company and as a whole. A couple examples are as following. American race prejudice must be destroyed. Hiring black engineers, firemen, and conductors on all American railroads. Lastly, representation in the President's Cabinet. Edward A. Savoy. Savoy had an interesting life. Born May 2nd, 1885, his father, Edward Louis Savoy, was born an enslaved man. His father held multiple trades, but most notably, he was a caterer at the White House. His father also had ties in activism along with his mother. With his destiny laid before him, it was quite literally in Savoy's bloodline to be destined for a bigger role. In his early formative years, his parents were maid and butlers to the Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish. Savoy attended the District of Columbia Public School and was later hired as a messenger by Secretary Fish only at the age of 14. In his early adulthood, he was tasked with staffing diplomatic meetings. He was to serve passports to departing diplomats, and he even had the chance to disengage arguments between diplomats at odds. He famously was an individual to serve the Spanish ambassador Luis Barnapé his passport just prior to the declaration of war upon Spain in 1898. As Savoy progressed through the years, so did the importance of his duties. He was known to frequent multiple international treaties, as well as presenting seals and ceremonial pens at these high-ranking events. He was present during the signing of the treaty that resulted in the construction of the Panama Canal. He was also present at the proceedings that led to the ratification of the Treaty of Portsmouth, ratified late November of 1905. This treaty led to the end of the war between Russia and Japan. After decades of service to the United States, Savoy had a bill passed honoring a 2-year extension of his service. Once his terms had ended, President Roosevelt sent a car for him to formally honor his retirement and work achieved throughout his astonishing 64 years of service. Of the 17 ships named in honor of Black history, there are a few individuals we can only touch on briefly. John Merrick, born in 1859 in Clinton, North Carolina, was an insurance executive. He established several companies, most notably being the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. His establishment of several companies gave him a highly respected legacy amongst the community. Paul Laurence Dunbar was an African-American poet and novelist born June 27, 1872 in Dayton, Ohio. He began writing poems at the age of 16, and by the end of his lifetime, he was well known to be the first internationally established African-American writers. Robert L. Vann was a newspaper publisher and editor born August 27, 1879. In his hometown, Ahoskie, North Carolina, Vann was the founder, publisher, and editor of the Pittsburgh Courier until his death in 1910. Bert Williams was an African-American comedian born November 12, 1874 in Nassau, located in the Bahamas. He had a legacy as an amazing entertainer that had a large audience reaching beyond the African-American community. Most notably, Williams was the first African-American to have a leading role in a film, as well as being the first to set foot in Broadway. John H. Murphy. Murphy was the founder of the Baltimore Afro-American, a newspaper publishing company. He was born December 25, 1840 in Baltimore, Maryland. The Baltimore Afro-American is still one of the oldest black family-owned publishing companies in existence to this present day. James Weldon Johnson. Johnson was an American writer born June 17, 1871. Johnson was a well-known leader in the NAACP, and he was later chosen as the executive secretary of the NAACP. As a writer, he became well-known during the Harlem Renaissance for his novels and poems. He notably wrote the lyrics for Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is still the African American national anthem. He also married civil rights activist Grace Nail Johnson. Toussaint L'Ouverture. L'Ouverture was a Haitian general and independence leader born in 1743 in Haiti. He was most notable for his role as governor and general. His two battles against the French led to the independence of Haiti. He was commonly referred to as the father of Haiti. To wrap up my presentation, the Second World War paved the way for many changes and many opportunities for the country as a whole, and specifically the African American community. The industrial boom at the height of the war provided many jobs to people of color, and saw new laws being passed that progressed the civil rights movement. The ships named in the honor of historically prominent African American figures was one step to recognizing that society needed to assemble as a whole. There were many hardships, opportunities, and obstacles along the way, but the timing of the Liberty ships were perfect given the circumstances. Today there remains 2 operational Liberty ships. One being close to home is the SS John Brown, docked in Baltimore, Maryland. SS John Brown underwent multiple remodels but still remains operational to this day. The other ship is SS Jeremiah O'Brien, which remains mostly to its operational glory. Thank you for tuning in into this evening's presentation on the history behind the Second World War Liberty ships. I hope you all found the history as fascinating as I did. I believe the key takeaway message is that perseverance almost always results in something great. Thank you and good evening.